History and Culture podcasts are a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to PCN's History and Culture podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. This podcast series features interviews exploring Pennsylvania's rich history from the colonial era to industrialization, the Gettysburg Campaign to sports history, and from art to politics and more.
Jack McCarthy, you wrote a book about the Mann Center for the Performing Arts in Philadelphia. What gives the Mann its distinctive character?
Well, the Mann Center was established in 1976 as a summer home for the Philadelphia Orchestra. And of course, the Philadelphia Orchestra is one of the greatest orchestras in the world. And it had a summer home prior to that, which was called the Robin Hood Dell, which opened in 1930. But in 1976, they opened this modern new facility, as a summer home for, again, one of the greatest orchestras in the world. And since then, the Mann has evolved to present a lot more pop and rock and contemporary music. So it's still a summer home for the orchestra, but it's also a much more varied venue in terms of the kind of music it presents. So it's really a treasure in Philadelphia for so many people who view it as just one of the great outdoor venues in the whole southeastern Pennsylvania region. The first thing that strikes a lot of people when they come to the Mann is the absolutely spectacular view of the Philadelphia skyline. When you walk into the Mann and you sort of turn a certain way and you just see the skyline in all its glory, and then it's in this beautiful natural setting in Fairmount Park. Fairmount Park is this sprawling thousands of acre, public park in Philadelphia along the Schuylkill River, and set in this beautiful natural setting. And it's just this very, aesthetically pleasing, attractive campus with all kinds of amenities. And then you have this amazing view of the Philadelphia skyline. So all those sort of aesthetic qualities kind of make the experience just a really special one. And then, of course, there's the music, which everybody comes to see. So between the music, which, the greatest artists in the world perform there, and between the setting and the view, it's just a really special kind of experience. I will say that what separates the Mann Center from a number of other summer homes of major orchestras is that it's in and of the city of Philadelphia. Like Tanglewood, the summer home of the Boston Symphony, it was like hundreds of miles from Boston. Saratoga, the summer home of the New York Philharmonic. Well, actually, Saratoga was established as a home of the New York Philharmonic. They ended up not playing there, but anyway, it's way outside of New York City in the upstate New York. And so all of these venues that are summer homes of major orchestras, they're not actually in the city. The Mann Center and the Robin Hood Dell before it, were really in the city and part of the cultural fabric of the city.
And Jack, before we go any farther, let our viewers know the difference between the Robin Hood Dell and the Mann Center. Were they built on the same site?
No. One is on the Schuylkill River is the main river that runs through Fairmount Park. The Robin Hood Dell was built on the east bank of the Schuylkill River in what's called East Fairmount Park. And then the Mann Center was built in West Fairmount Park, in the western part. So the Robin Hood Dell opened in 1930. And in that year, there was a number of people in the civic and musical world of Philadelphia that wanted to have a summer home for the Philadelphia Orchestra. Again, one of the great orchestras in the world, but only people who could afford or had, the means to go to the Academy of Music, downtown Philadelphia, the orchestra's regular season home. Only the people that could go there could actually see the orchestra. And so these civic leaders, musical leaders wanted to create a place where everybody could see the orchestra. So they banded together and they opened the Robin Hood Dell in 1930. And then the orchestra played there for 45 years. And then the Dell had sort of gotten outmoded, and it was all open air, so the weather was always a factor. It was wreaking havoc on the schedule. And then the other thing that happened in late 1950s, the Schuylkill Expressway opened, this major highway just on the other side of the Schuylkill River, and the sound of the traffic carried over and really disturbed the concert experience. So for all these reasons, the leaders realized they needed a new home. So, and Frederick Mann, who was the longtime president of the Robin Hood Dell, and he was a very active civic leader and businessman, very wealthy businessman, benefactor, philanthropist. He was the driving force in those days, and he arranged to have a new venue built again in the western part of Fairmount Park. It was originally called Robin Hood Dell West, to differentiate it from what then became Robin Hood Dell East. And then in 1979, they named it the Mann Music Center in honor of Frederick Mann.
Well,
And then,
Jack, let's concentrate more on the events of 1930 when the Robin Hood Dell was first put up. What was the impact of the Great Depression on the construction of Robin Hood Dell in those days?
well, actually, it's an excellent question. The fortunate thing is that the effort to build the Robin Hood Dell sort of culminated right after the Depression technically started, but a couple of years before the worst effects of the Depression set in. It was really like 1932, 1933 when the height of the Depression. If the effort to build the Dell had started like 2 or 3 years earlier, it's very doubtful they would have been able to pull it off. But they were able to do it right before the worst of the Depression happened. And, it's very, very fortunate.
How important was the Philadelphia Orchestra to the social fabric of Philadelphia, again, back in 1930?
Well, again, the Philadelphia Orchestra was founded in 1900. And then in 1912, they hired this extremely charismatic, innovative conductor, Leopold Stokowski, he's the one that molded the orchestra into a world-class ensemble. It was world renowned for both its sound and its technical virtuosity. And also, Stokowski was a real innovator. He was exploring new technologies of recording and broadcasting music. He was programming a lot of new music, modern music that was just being written. So he kind of put the orchestra on the international stage. It became world renowned. And so it was really a cultural jewel of the city. It was something that everybody in and around Philadelphia was very proud of. We have one of the greatest orchestras in the world. And so, again, this movement began like, let's let more people hear this orchestra, not just the people that could go to the Academy of Music. So all those efforts culminated in the opening of the Robin Hood Dell in 1930. And the concerts were very well attended. They were very affordable. It was like 50 cents a ticket in some cases. I mean, it was extremely economical. And, people came from all over the city. And so it was a real success. It did have a lot of challenges financially in the ensuing years. And there was one season in 1948 when they ran out of money and they had to close the Dell in the middle towards the end of the summer season. They had to cancel the last 3 weeks of concerts. So at that point, that's when Frederick Mann joined the board and sort of took over and rescued the Dell and brought it back to prominence and financial stability. And so he looms large in the whole story.
And we'll talk about him some more for sure, Jack. But for now, while you did research for your book, did you ever find out why they named it the Robin Hood Dell?
Yeah, there was in the part of the Fairmount Park where they established the Dell, there was going back to the 1600s, the the family that owned that property was called the Hood family, and in later generations they operated a tavern called the Robin Hood Tavern, and behind the tavern the land sloped down a natural dell to the Schuylkill River. So this Robin Hood, originally it was called Robin Hood Valley, and then when they decided, the leaders, working on creating a summer home for the orchestra, when they chose that site, they just took the name Robin Hood. They called it the Robin Hood Dell. So that's how the name originated.
In your book, you called Philadelphia a racially divided city back in 1930. Well, how was that manifested at the Dell at the time?
Well, and Philadelphia was not alone in this. So a lot of the big cities were very racially divided, and so the audience, was primarily white, because the music was the music of the great European masters. Some American music, but composed in the European tradition. So the audiences and the music and the musicians and everybody was overwhelmingly white. But then, very early on, they started booking, African American artists. There was an ensemble called the Hall Johnson Choir, a black choir that performed the arrangements of spirituals that its leader, Hall Johnson, um, wrote. And so they were a big hit in the early 30s. And for those concerts, the audience was very diverse. A lot of blacks, a lot of whites, and then later, Marian Anderson performed at the Robin Hood Dell. Paul Robeson, these are all people with local ties. Marian Anderson, grew up in Philadelphia. So the audience for those concerts was very racially mixed. But for the most part, for the regular orchestra concerts, it was primarily a white audience. And then, now and in more recent years, and after the Mann Center opened in the 70s, they really began to diversify their audience. And now it's a wide range of programming that, embraces all kinds of orchestras. Of course, the Roots Picnic, right? The Philadelphia band, the Roots, very, world famous. They have a picnic every year. That's a 2-day event, a massive event. It's one of the biggest events in Black music in the world, really, and thousands of people attend. And so the Roots picnic in recent years has been staged at the Mann Center. So there's a lot of sort of diversity now, but in the earlier years, the diversity was a little more specific to certain events.
Well, here's another observation, Jack, you made in your book, and it's about band leader Benny Goodman. You said he integrated the Dell stage back in 1941. First, tell us the importance of Benny Goodman and his status in those days, and how he did indeed integrate the stage there.
Yeah, so Benny Goodman in the 30s and early 40s was the biggest band leader in America. This was the height of the swing era of the big bands, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, the Dorsey brothers. And Benny Goodman was the biggest. He was the king of swing. And so he had a lot of sway. And in those days, it was unusual, or almost, I wouldn't even, more than unusual, is very, very rare for Black and white musicians to play together on a major stage. They may jam together at a local club or something like that, but to play on a major stage, a major venue, it was pretty racially divided. And what he did is, his band was so big and so popular that he had a small ensemble, a quartet, quintet, that would always open his shows before the big band played. And he integrated this small ensemble, and he basically forced venue operators across the country to accept that, because he said, if you don't let my small integrated ensemble play, you're not going to get the Benny Goodman Orchestra, which was the biggest orchestra in the world, right? Or big band in the world. So when he came to the Robin Hood Dell, so prior to that, there were Black performers, as I mentioned, the Hall Johnson Choir, Marian Anderson, but they were always separate from the orchestra. They weren't like integrated right into the orchestra. There were no Black members of the orchestra, of the Philadelphia Orchestra. But on Benny Goodman's debut there in 1941, he had an integrated band. So that was the first time at the Robin Hood Dell that an integrated ensemble performed.
Well, let's talk about another watershed moment at the Dell, and it involves Judy Garland, who was a big star at the time in 1943. And what's very interesting to note is that it was her very first concert in public, which is kind of surprising because she sang on film, of course.
Yeah, she was a big star on film, on recordings, on the radio, but she had never done like a public concert, as a headline artist. And her very first one, was with, in those days, it was called the Robin Hood Dell Orchestra. It was comprised 90% of Philadelphia orchestra players, but they wanted to differentiate between the regular season orchestra and the summer orchestra. So in those days, it was called the Robin Hood Dell Orchestra, but it was essentially the Philadelphia Orchestra. So her very first public concert was, in 1943 at the Robin Hood Dell, and it was an enormous success. And that sort of launched her concert career, which became a big part of her her career.
And I understand Frank Sinatra made a surprise appearance at the Dell in 1945, and that was the height of what was referred to as the Bobby Soxer era at the time, right?
Yeah, so Frank Sinatra was the biggest star in those days. He had, started with the Dorsey Orchestra and then went solo, huge star. He was like the idol of all the teenage Bobby Soxer, female fans. And his good friend Dinah Shore was a singer, later became well known as a TV host. But she had an engagement there at the Robin Hood Dell, and he came to see her. And, he sat in the audience, and then she invited him up to sing a few songs, and the crowd went wild. It was, this sort of amazing event. He sang a few songs, to great applause, and that was the only time he ever performed at the Robin Hood Dell or later the Mann Center.
Then in the early 1960s, youth culture was starting to assert itself and rock and roll. And how well did the Dell keep up with changing tastes? I understand they had Jerry Blavat, their local DJ, very popular.
Yeah, so this was a real point of contention. So the Robin Hood Dell was, partly privately funded, partly funded by the city. And Frederick Mann, who had invested so much of his, not just his own money, but his life's work in this facility, he loved classical music, but he just detested rock and roll. So he saw the Robin Hood Dell as this bastion of, symphonic music. It was built to be that. That's what it should be. It shouldn't be anything else. But these other forces were starting to exert themselves. And people were saying, well, this is our public tax dollars, and it shouldn't go to just this elitist group of people who like this one kind of music. It should be for everybody. So there were these efforts to sort of produce other kinds of music at the Robin Hood Dell. So the very first quote unquote rock and roll concert was in 1967. Jerry Blavat, who was a very popular DJ in Philadelphia, his catchphrase was "the Geeter with the heater." Everybody in the Philadelphia area knew him, and he was, not just a DJ, but he hosted dances, and so he produced this show with a lot of local artists and a lot of national artists, and it was also integrated. There was, black and white performers, and it was a big hit. Tens of thousands of people attended. Freddie Mann hated it, but it was kind of the start. It was really kind of a one-off, but then more and more they began to program concerts, not during the orchestra season, because that usually ended in late July. But after the orchestra season had concluded, they began to present a lot of contemporary pop and rock and roll, and then just over time that became more and more of the part of the venue's programming.
Earlier, you told me about the disruption created by traffic on a highway that had been opened nearby. And there's another aspect of disruption to the events there in the form of planes flying overhead. Now, this was noted in your book. You said that planes flying overhead, they were a nuisance too. And there was an effort made to detour that air traffic. Tell me about that so people could enjoy the show at the Dell.
Yeah, so in addition to the Schuylkill Expressway opening in the late 1950s, jet air travel began to become more common, like jet airplanes instead of little propeller airplanes, right? So now you have these jets roaring across the night sky, and they were very disruptive to the concert experience as well. And Frederick Mann, as I said, he had a number of positions in city government, and at that time he was direct city representative and director of commerce for the city, and he had responsibility over the Philadelphia airport. So he used his authority to have planes detoured around the Robin Hood Dell on concert nights. And there were like these posters and these notices that went out to all the airplanes with these maps and saying, on these nights, you got to fly this route and not that route. And so that was one thing he did to sort of, minimize the noise of modern life.
It's hard to imagine somebody having that much clout.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there weren't as many planes, right, in those days as there are right now. So it probably wasn't quite as impactful. But yeah, he was enormously influential. He had a number of positions in city government, in addition to being a businessman and philanthropist and musical leader.
In your book, you wrote that Frederick Mann rescued the Robin Hood Dell. That was the word you used. Why did it need rescuing?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, in 1948, it really ran into financial trouble. He was not on the board at that time, and it just, the audiences were, the numbers were low, and the fundraising was a little weak, and so they had to cancel the last part of the 1948 season. And the board members went to Frederick Mann. They knew he was a wealthy philanthropist who was passionate about classical music. And they went to him and said, we need help. So he agreed to come on and be president of the board if they would give him sort of absolute power to run the venue the way he saw fit. And they did. And, he again rescued the Dell from financial ruin, investing a lot of his own money, which was never publicized, but also raising money from his wealthy friends. But also, more importantly, he had developed very close friendships with all of the great classical music artists of that era, the late 40s and early 50s. He was friends with all of them: Arthur Rubinstein and Isaac Stern and Gregor Piatigorsky, the great cellist. I mean, he knew these people very well, and he got them to come and play at the Dell, sometimes for free, sometimes for very reduced fees. So he enhanced the quality of the music, and he stabilized the finances. And then in 1953, he did one of the most radical things ever, is he made the entire season free. He was able to fundraise and get the city to match the fundraising and to put on an entire, I think in those days it was 6 weeks of concerts by one of the greatest orchestras in the world, completely for free, an entire season for free. It was unheard of in America. And people would, the coupons would be published in the newspapers. You would clip them out and send in a self-addressed stamped envelope and say, I want tickets to this concert, and they would mail you the tickets. I mean, you had to put in the effort, but it was free. And, people flocked to the Dell. It was a huge success, and it made headlines all across the country. Philadelphia creates an entire season of world-class classical music completely for free. So, he was just a really influential, impactful transformational person, in Philadelphia music history.
And eventually they changed the name of the Dell to the Mann Center. That was in 1976.
Right. So they moved to the new facility in 1976, and they originally called it the Robin Hood Dell West to distinguish it from the first facility. And then a few years later, they renamed it in honor of Frederick Mann, who was still running the show, but they named it in his honor.
Jack, when the COVID-19 pandemic came along, how did the Mann handle this new concept of social distancing and putting on shows?
Well, it was a real challenge. The first thing is they had to cancel the entire 2020 season. I mean, that was a huge blow. They had everything lined up, and actually they had just signed an agreement with Live Nation, the biggest concert promoter in the world, to book the rock and pop and contemporary music shows. They literally signed an agreement in early in 2020. And then like a couple of weeks later, they had to shut down the entire season. And that was, again, a major blow. They did a lot of fundraising to help carry them over. And then the next season, they had to implement all of these measures. They had to check people's vaccination. People had to wear masks. People had to be separated. Now, at one point, the city said, there had to be 6 feet between every seat, which would have meant that the 2/3 of the seats couldn't be used. So it would have been a disaster for the Mann financially. It wouldn't have been able to put on concerts with only a fraction of the people attending. But in late spring, the city rescinded that requirement, and they were able to actually sell all the seats. But yeah, I mean, it was a real challenge. They had to enact all these security measures, and but they made it through, and they came out a much stronger organization.
Jack, we only have 2 minutes left on our program. When did you first visit the Mann Center? What was the occasion? What do you remember?
I'm sorry to say that I'm a historian. I do not remember what the first concert was. I know I went there many times. I specifically remember seeing the B-52s.
Great.
The sort of new wave rock band.
Sure.
I remember seeing Elvis Costello. I remember seeing the Neville Brothers. And I also went to some orchestra concerts too. I remember, and actually when I started going, they still had those free tickets that you had to mail the coupons in. They stopped that in the, I think, late 80s, early 90s. But I did go and see a few orchestra concerts, and I did go to see a number of, rock and pop shows. I couldn't remember all of them. I couldn't remember the years.
But you have some pleasant memories at the Mann.
I do. And like everybody, I was just struck by the beauty of the. Both the the interior, the wood paneling of the auditorium, the outdoor, the seating, the colorful seats, the beautiful skyline, the beautiful sloping landscape, and all these amenities. There's all these food concessions and things like that. It's just a very kind of enriching experience. And they're doing, as we speak, they're doing a major renovation of the Mann, complete renovation of the campus, much more visitor amenities. They're going to have an expanded visitor center with displays and a hall of fame of all the great performers that are performed there. You're going to be able to call up photos and audio of some of the great performances. It's going to be like a real visitor experience.
Jack McCarthy, author of A Century of Music Under the Stars, a history of the Mann Center for the Performing Arts and Robin Hood Dell. Thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PCN's history and culture content, like the interview you just heard, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. Explore other documentary programs, event coverage, and a lot more. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.